Now that we have our Hacker News API service, we can make API requests from within our application using Redux. To do this, we will use Redux Thunk, and what this is a way to manage side effects within Redux. And the side effect is something if it modifies the state outside of our local environment. So this could be making an API request, using local storage, anything like that. And to do this, we're using Redux Thunk, but there's other ways to manage side effects such as Redux Saga, Redux Promise, anything that will allow you to execute functions through actions. But in its simplest form, that's what a thunk is. When you dispatch a function, you are able to dispatch new actions inside that function, in our case, a request. So let's initialize our story reducer and actions. Create the actions.js file and reducer.js. And inside our actions, we're going to import Hacker News API from our services. And we'll namespace it at Hacker News clone story. And we'll create our action types. And in this case, we'll have action types for the request, success, and failure state for fetching the story IDs and fetching the stories. So fetch story IDs requests, and then copy this down. Success. And failure for the story IDs. And then we'll have one for fetch stories as well. Let's create a quick helper function. We know that every action is going to take a type and a payload, so let's just abstract that away real quick. Typically, we would put this in a utils folder shared by stores, but we'll only use it in this case, and to keep things a little more visible, a little more transparent on what we're doing, I'll just put it right here. We'll take a type and a payload and return an object with a key type and a payload. And now we can create our actions. And like I said, in this case, our actions will actually be functions. So fetch story IDs will be a function that takes a payload. And then Thunk expects you to return another function that takes dispatch as an argument, which allows us to dispatch the actions inside of our function. And we'll dispatch that our action fetch story IDs request has started with the payload. And then we return a promise. So Hacker News API get top story IDs. So this will initiate the request for our stories. Then story IDs. So once we have these story IDs, what do we want to do? This means we've initiated our application. We have the IDs. What makes sense now would to just go ahead and fetch the first page. So since we can dispatch actions within our function, we'll say dispatch. First we'll dispatch that we had success, action types, fetch story ID success, and we'll send the payload of story IDs. And then we'll dispatch an action, which is we will create a fetch stories function within this actions object and say fetch stories using the story IDs, and we know we'll be on page 0. So we haven't created this fetch stories function yet, but we will after we complete this. Then return story IDs for completion and handle the error case. Dispatch, action types, fetch story IDs failure. And then we'll pass the payload as the error. Great, so now we have our action to fetch story IDs, which is in this case a function utilizing our Redux Thunk package. Now let's create a fetch stories function. So once again, we'll return a function that takes dispatch as an argument. We will dispatch the action types dot fetch stories request with the payload. And we know our payload should have the story IDs in it as well as the page we're on. So we'll extract those using our object destructuring syntax. And now we return hacker news API. We'll get stories by page, story IDs page. Then we'll receive the stories in an array, which is an array of objects with the story items. And we'll dispatch the success action types dot fetch stories success with the stories we received. And then handle the error case here, similar to our previous function. Dispatch action types fetch stories failure error. And there we go. Those are the actions that we need to make API requests inside of Redux using Thunk and export the actions. That was in our reducer file. Let's copy those over quickly to the actions, and now let's actually build the reducer. So inside of our reducer file, we will import the action types from actions. And then we always want to create an initial state for our object inside the reducer. So get initial state, which returns, fix the syntax, and we'll return object with story IDs where the initial array is empty. Our stories, an empty array, start on page 0. Is fetching will be false, and an error will just be an empty string. Now our story reducer, get initial state as the default value. We'll have a type and a payload inside of our action. And then this is a function. It will be a switch statement, and it will look at the type. And then on the case of action types dot fetch story IDs request, as well as action types dot stories fetch stories request, return the previous state and set fetching to true. And when you have the syntax like this, it will just match both cases to this one block. Now let's have a case when we have a successful story IDs fetch state, or set state, set payload, and it will just be in the form of story IDs. Let's handle our default case just to get this highlighting out of the way. It's fetching true here. Return state. And now let's handle the case action types.fetch stories success. So return the state, the stories, state.stories, and then the payload.stories. So here we're actually spreading the state.stories and the payload.stories within this array since it's a nested value. So this ensures that we're creating a new array instead of mutating the old one. And then it will keep them in the order which we get them. So it'll add all the previous stories found first and then add the new stories. When we have a fetch story success, we know we want to increment the page by 1. And we'll set our fetching to false. And now export our reducer. So now we have actions and a reducer for the stories, and we want to import the reducer into our root reducer. So import story from story reducer. And now let's take a look at our application. We do see that we have the initial value for the story key in our reducer.